Hey everyone. So, following my award winning interview with Mormonism with the Murph, I received a challenge from the Murph to go over the LDS Truth Claim series held by Brett McDonald over a series of about 35 different videos on YouTube. And to talk about the positive case, especially, was what the Murph was interested in. Um, I have found the series to be a bit interesting. If you're not familiar with it already, it represents about 35 different lectures done in what appears to be like the Relief Society room in a chapel somewhere. The sound quality on those videos is horrible, and so I won't be showing direct clips from it, and at least not in this video. As I kind of go through the rest of this series, I, based off of like comments and feedback and all of that, may change the format a bit. Um, but I was interested in tackling this as well because the Murph has talked about this being a very informative, positive case for his experiences and for his decision to come back into the church and to recognize that there might be more of a nuanced case for the church's truth claims than what he had previously assumed, especially during his faith crisis. And so I wanted to address it just from that perspective. There's also been some stuff that's been addressed in Book of Enoch material that's been talked about in some of the apologetic circles recently that refers back to the LDS Truth Claim series. So that is what brings us to this particular issue today. So Brett McDonald is uh, he has a bit of training in philosophy from his undergraduate education at BYU, and it appears that this is primarily focused on like religion and theology. If I understand correctly, based off of like some of the comments that have been online, YouTube comments, Reddit AMAs, that sort of thing. And I don't think that there's any reason to find that false. And I will say that looking at the history of BYU's undergraduate philosophy program, like many undergraduate philosophy programs, epistemology is listed as a potential course that you can take. It's like an option course during your like when you're doing your senior level major material. And so it's possible that Brett took a course in epistemology. It's possible that he didn't. Regardless, he should at least have had some kind of overview education in epistemology. That's what I would actually expect. I would also expect him to be careful in his presentation of epistemology, especially to a lay audience. Now, again, I want to caveat: I am a lay audience. I am not trained in any philosophical methods. My interest in philosophy is purely as a hobby, and, and that's the approach that I have coming into it. What it means is if I can spot obvious problems in what Brett is presenting, then these problems are pretty severe and they need to be dealt with. And if not, if he is presenting something that is actually consistent here at this introductory stage, then okay, maybe it's fine. Or at least maybe we have something to operate off of. So what Brett wanted to do in this is he wanted to present an epistemological framework, or at least ostensibly what he wants to do is present an epistemological framework for evaluating the claims of Mormonism, for evaluating these truth claims that we're going to go through the rest of this LDS truth claim series. And so at the end of this, what I am expecting to gain from this presentation is a sense of, okay, Brett McDonald is going to aim to prove Mormonism is true based off of this particular epistemic standard. If he's successful in that, even if I don't agree that that's a good epistemic standard, I can at least say Brett achieved that. Through this process, he showed that if you apply this particular epistemic standard, then you would find that Mormonism is true. And we'll ultimately see what he goes through and does. So, well, if I do recommend you go and watch the video to really understand the full context of all of this. And hopefully in watching that, you understand that I am presenting what he presents as he presented it, and that I'm not like cherry picking it or mischaracterizing it or falsifying things that he says. So what Brett does is he introduces this idea of evidentialism as a potential epistemology that we can use. And I think that the motivation in this is to create a contrast with sort of scientific reasoning. So Brett gives a definition of evidentialism that reads, a proposition P is rational if and only if P is self-evident, evident to the senses, or incorrigible, or if P can be inferred from a set of propositions that are self-evident, evident to the senses, or incorrigible. Now, this particular definition of evidentialism caught me as being a bit peculiar, a bit odd. It didn't really strike me as being consistent with the idea of basing your epistemology off of like the quality or the standard of the evidence, which is more generally what the definition of of evidentialism is given as. That it's this branch out of sort of like rational thought and all that. Um, yeah, so I spent a lot of time searching for like different definitions of evidentialism to see if I could line them up with this definition. And I failed at doing that after like several different searches. What I ended up finding instead was something that I'm going to go ahead and pull into this. We'll go ahead and take a look at an article that is present in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And here in this article, we see rather a definition for classical foundationalism. And right here, we have the exact definition that Brett gave, word for word. This is exactly the same definition that Brett gave for evidentialism. However, it's applied to this other alternate concept of classical foundationalism. Well, it's possible. So what I found here was like the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Maybe this isn't a very reliable source. It's interesting that this is word for word exactly the same. It's also interesting that this claims to be a peer-reviewed academic resource. Now, again, I am a layperson. I don't know all the details. Potentially, what I'm talking about here is not actually all that credible in terms of like the philosophical discussion. So I went a little bit further. And I looked at this author that is mentioned in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy with relation to classical foundationalism. One of the critics of classical foundationalism, Plantinga. I'm almost certainly butchering the pronunciation of this. However, looked at the research that's associated with that particular author, found one of his critics who also like agreed that like this definition of classical foundationalism is held by Plantinga, or however it's pronounced, and is also going to be like this definition of classical foundationalism that author was then going to defend. So what it appears happens is that Brett, someone who is trained in philosophy, who should be aware of this, who should have like the resources necessary to like evaluate these and all of that to understand like how to present properly to a lay audience, and to even present like the limits of his own knowledge, presents as the definition of evidentialism the definition of classical foundationalism, a whole separate field of um, of epistemology, a completely different approach to epistemology. It has this thing with assuming like basic beliefs that act as like a foundation. Anyway, stuff that isn't actually recognized by evidentialism. Then he goes on to say that, his definition of evidentialism is not supported by evidentialism, which is the arguments that are made by Plantinga. So this is really odd to me that he is using the exact same criticisms of classical foundationalism that Plantinga makes, but he's attributing those to being against evidentialism. I don't know why he's doing that. I also think that I don't want to make accusations necessarily, but this does potentially represent a case of falsification, where he is presenting like falsely information as saying something that it doesn't actually say from these other academic sources. And it's potentially just wasn't careful. If he wasn't careful, that's a problem. Now, part of the limitation in this is that Brett does not cite his source. He does not list where this definition of evidentialism comes from. If he's quoting a specific author of like famous philosophy, like when he quotes Kierkegaard or Lewis or others, like he is good about like saying this is where I got that from, like who says this, where even the book is, what book that particular quote comes from. He's good at doing that. What he doesn't do though is when he's talking about evidentialism, provide sources. That also stood out to me as being a potential issue. Um, So we're already kind of not off to a great start in this series. Remember, this is supposed to be the series that should pull us into saying this is the best case for LDS truth claims according to people who believe in this stuff, who have wrestled with this stuff and have come out on the other side believing. And we're off to the races with a flat out misrepresentation of concepts that the presenter should be very much familiar with. Now, here's the thing. I know as part of this series that Brett is going to start talking about things about the Book of Enoch and how that might relate into some other things that Joseph Smith was doing. He's going to talk about the Book of Abraham. He's going to talk about the witnesses. He's going to get the historical criticisms, Book of Mormon related criticisms, and some of the things associated with like Nahum and all of that. I know he's going to get into that stuff. He's going to talk about Margaret Barker's work and like the temple theology and how Lehi's context may or may not relate to that. He's going to touch on all of that stuff, and he's not trained in that. Near as I can tell, he has not received any formal training in any of the associated disciplines there. He does have formal training in philosophy, and where he has that formal training, he completely drops the ball, completely presents like a false representation of these ideas. Whether on purpose or by accident, I have no way of knowing. And I'm not trying to like make an accusation about intent behind it. But the execution is the same. For making a consequentialist argument here, Brett, the consequences are the same regardless of what your intentions were. And this is the outcome. Now, after basically deconstructing that false representation of evidentialism, Brett goes on to basically reject the idea of there being a coherent, consistent epistemic standard that he can or ought to set for this. Problem is, Brett, the ball's in your court. You're making the positive claim. You hold the burden of proof. And you should be clear if you are going to talk about epistemology to your audience. You should be clear about what epistemic standard you are operating off of to argue for the truth. So we can evaluate it according to that standard. He's right. Throughout this presentation, he says everybody has their own epistemology. And that's true enough. That's fine. But that does not absolve you of making the case for your epistemology, for that standard that you're going to argue to, and then for actually doing the work to meet that standard. If you're going to drop the ball there, I don't know. Like, this is not a good start. This is not a good start to what is supposed to be this great series. Now, what I'm going to do from here, ultimately, is I'm going to start talking about the witnesses. I'm going to talk about the formal and the informal witnesses, and I may or may not combine these into one episode. To be honest, in other settings, I have talked about what I think about the value of the witnesses. Other people find it valuable. I really don't, and I may ultimately end up referring to other sources, and we may roll up all that conversation into a single review. There's about 4 or 5 episodes coming up, and so I'm going to watch through those. I'll see where we go from there. Like I said, just because of the audio quality of that series, I'm not going to, I don't intend at this point of showing clips from it. But if it starts to kind of get in the way of understanding, if the response to this is that it's unclear what it is that I'm trying to communicate based off this, I'll do a re-record, all that, fix that, and include some of those clips because it should be clear what's being communicated, what I'm arguing here. Ultimately, in conclusion on this one, Brett makes an argument against evidentialism as sort of an alternate position or an alternate epistemology for his position that he's ultimately going to be taking. And in so doing, presents the wrong definition of evidentialism, knocks down that wrong definition, and then in sort of a weird almost binary way, he then goes on to say that there is no consistent epistemic standard that he's going to bother following. And this gets challenged actually as well in some later comments. If you go to the second episode, read the comments in there, a viewer specifically asks him about like the epistemic standard, about like the preponderance of the evidence standard. And Brett makes this exact point that I'm describing. If you think that I'm presenting this wrong, go ahead and like correct me and all that. We can have that discussion. But this is what Brett has said in these comments. So this is coming from his own lips on that. And I just think it's irresponsible. I think it's a very irresponsible standard. And it's an intellectually lazy standard to set. You should pick an epistemic standard and run with it. For the rest of our series on this side, what I will be saying is that I am going to be putting the Book of Mormon, all of this. And if I were to make a naturalistic claim, I would say it has to meet such that it comports with reality as adjudicated by predictive power. I'm going to borrow that from Apologia. I really like that as a good sort of general understanding. What is true? What can we know? Well, does it comport with the reality as we observe it? And does it actually, like, if you make predictions based off of that, does it continue to work? Does it continue to fit? And if it doesn't, then you've got something that's a little bit wrong and you got to make the adjustments accordingly. So yeah, that's where we're going to go with this one. I hope you continue to follow me throughout the series, and I'm pretty excited for going through the rest of this, and we'll see what happens. And, like, comment, subscribe, all of that fun stuff, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.